This is All Out Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. Politicians tend to promise a lot during election campaigns, and both candidates in the Conservative leadership race have pledged to cut taxes and increase spending, much to the dismay of the Chancellor Philip Hammond. So do their sums add up? Joining me to discuss that are Miata Fanbuller. She's the CEO of the New Economics Foundation and a one-time advisor to Ed Miliband, and Warwick Lightfoot, Head of Economics and Social Policy at Policy Exchange and a former advisor to 3 Conservative Chancellors. Welcome to you both. Now, I've got here what the Institute for Fiscal Studies are saying about Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt's proposals, and I think it's fair to say they're not very impressed. I mean, they say a lot of money is flowing out and the money isn't there.
Well, they're right not to be impressed. I mean, in some respects, for us, I think what we're starting to see in the Tory party is that they're beginning to concede that actually governments do need to spend, governments do need to invest in order to stimulate the economy. Now, some of us have been arguing this for about 10 years through the period of austerity, so there is progress. I think the problem is they're spending in all the wrong ways. So you take Boris Johnson's proposal to increase the higher rate of tax, that's going to cost us about 10 billion a year, and it's going to benefit the top 10%. Or their proposals, both of them have now said that they're going to increase the threshold at which people start paying national insurance contribution each year. 8 billion a year. And the analysis that we've done at the New Economics Foundation suggests that the top 20% will get about £560 for this. The bottom 20% will only get £80. So it's really regressive. So it's more about their priorities. You know, when we've got 14 million people living in poverty, when we've got our public services, the NHS, social care, schools, under pressure on their knees, when you've got a climate emergency and the need to invest to green our economy, why are they choosing the things that they are?
But the headline principle of spending more, you think we could do that? Because, of course, Philip Hammond yesterday suggested there isn't a lot of money.
Well, so we can do more. And the reality is having a conversation about borrowing to invest. And, you know, borrowing has been this dirty word for the last 10 years. But governments borrow all the time. In the same way that businesses borrow in order to invest in things that will yield a return, governments should borrow in order to invest in things that will yield a return.
You won't want to hear this. You sound like Nigel Farage
I don't want to hear that.
A few minutes ago. What do you think?
Well, I actually have some sympathy for all the people who took part in this leadership election. Because it's very easy when you sit in a think tank to climb on a very high stool, look down a very long nose, mark everybody's homework and announce that nothing's coherent and nothing adds up. In a leadership election, you expect people to set out their ambition, their direction of travel and things they would actually like to do. Now, the main thing I'm struck by, not just the two who are in at the moment, but the ones who went before, was the common ground between them. I didn't see a sharp difference, actually. They're drawing on the so-called one nation tradition, which, to cut to the quick, is a conservative agenda of public services, a genuine and effective social safety net, balanced by an economy that's efficient and yields the tax revenue to pay for those public services, which is pretty much the consensus that's been in play, actually, both under Labour, coalition and Conservative governments since around 1985. They're trying to identify what their spending priorities will be in the comprehensive spending review, and also what they'd like to do over a 5 or 10 year period if they get the chance. So I think people have been a little bit unreasonable, and when you're doing an election, you do it like a revivalist meeting. You don't do it like an afternoon.
Okay, well, all right. Well, let's take those two proposals, Boris Johnson's proposals and Jeremy Hunt's proposals. Boris Johnson, the first thing we heard was this raising the threshold for better off taxpayers, which surprised a lot of people. I mean, between Jeremy Hunt's proposal and Boris Johnson's proposals, do you have any preference? I
think it's a question of balance between the two. The first thing I'd say, it's very interesting that the Cabinet and the contenders for leadership are identifying scope to actually increase public spending in a focused and targeted way. But they also recognise the need to actually constrain the tax burden. And I think that's a welcome thing, to recognise that public spending has a real resource cost. And, of course, every year the Treasury will, without fail, collect more revenue in normally without the tax system being adjusted. Now, what's happened is, when I worked at the Treasury, we had the 40% tax rate, but only about 4 or 5% of people actually paid it. And over fiscal drag, it's descended down the earnings distribution. And you can't, on the one hand, say, I want people to do training, I want you to become an apprentice, I want you to become a heating engineer, if you're going to be dragged into a 40p rate that effectively becomes the standard rate if you're not careful. So I think over time, not all in one budget, but over time, that's one thing I would very much want to see a chance of doing. In terms of the business taxes, I'm very interested in the way both of them, Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson, identify the real difficulties with business rates at the moment. And I think something's going to have to be looked at there. And if you want to come back on the details of the corporation tax, I'm happy to talk about it in a second.
Yeah.
So, corporation tax, why slash it to 12.5% when we have one of the lowest corporation taxes in the G7? And, the question about, when you've got public services that are in desperate need of investment, and there is consensus about that across the political spectrum, I think there's general support for that in the public. When we know that we've got an economy that's not working for people, when we know that we've got families that are feeling huge pressure, when we've got communities that have been left behind, why would you prioritise tax cuts that benefit those that are most well off in our society? It makes absolutely no sense. And if you cut taxes, that is revenue that you are constraining that would go into investing in our public services. So it is about the priorities of these set of Tory leaders. And for me, it just spells of a kind of complete sense of being out of touch with the genuine challenges and the real visceral challenges that are being felt by people across the country.
There's a very real challenge for politicians, which is actually, do you actually spend more money today, which most of us would actually like? And spend probably more than is optimal within your economy. So you grow less, you have a smaller tax revenue take, so that in future, 10, 15 years down the road, you will not be able to afford public services on the scale that you otherwise would be. Now, I recognise that in our political community at the moment, people want to trade a bit of public services today and accept there'll be a bit less growth in the future.
They're also talking about a period of austerity when there has been quite a big contraction.
What you've actually seen is, over the last 20 years, a very substantial increase in public spending that did not yield the results that were hoped for, that coincided with a very serious international recession. And so you had the worst of all possible worlds. Public spending that was not delivering what it was intended to do, with very disappointing results, and productivity in the public sector falling for those 10 years before 2010, with a structural budget deficit, which was around 2/3 of the 10% of GDP. You couldn't sustain that. That something had to be done there. We're now in the luxury, as the Chancellor, Mr Hammond, says, of being able to make choices about public spending, about our priorities. I mean, Policy Exchange has got some priorities. So we would say we think we should do more on defence. We also published a paper on long-term care. And we're very, very keen to actually accept that more's got to be put into long-term care and social care in general. So, we'll all have our priorities, and we're trying to get ours in.
Jeremy Hunt
Warwick, you said there was no progress. You look at 1995, you look at the state of our public services, you look at the state of our schools, you look at NHS waiting times, and actually you had a period of investment that yielded returns. Our waiting times went down, we saw huge investment in schools and hospitals, and yes, there was then a global financial crisis, and we are mopping up the consequences of this. But for me, actually, the big question is, investment does stimulate the economy. There's been a kind of, and there's a big debate between your Keynesian economist and your others about this. But I think now, we're seeing across the world that people are saying you've got to invest to grow the economy, but invest in the right way. I
just want to ask you finally, to what extent is this all fantasy politics? I mean, do you think any of this is going to happen, or is this just crowd pleasers for the Tory voters?
I think you're going to have a comprehensive spending review where different priorities are going to be scored. It's very important that you don't do what we did in the 10 years before 2010, where you build the hospital but you haven't got the doctor. You've got the school with a laboratory without the science teacher. And that's why it was very disappointing in those years. The results didn't come through. Just read the Public Accounts Committee's review of those programmes. It's a serial disappointment. And the ONS identified falling and stagnant productivity across the public service. That's the mistake we mustn't repeat in the next spending round.
So you must spend and you must reform at the same time. Is it fantasy politics? It is, because at the same time as they're talking all about all of this, they're talking about a no-deal Brexit. And let's be absolutely clear, in the context of a no-deal Brexit, the economy will take a hit, which means there'll be less money to go around. And then critically, the government will have to borrow just to firefight, just to try and sort out the kind of immediate mess that will come out of it. And then for me, the real clincher is actually the political bandwidth, the space to do the big things that they need to do. We all agree we need to reform the economy so that it works for everyone. They will have no space to do that because they'll be mopping up the mess. They'll be trying to patch together some kind of deal with our biggest trading bloc on our doorstep. So it is for the birds to be talking about all of this, at the same time talking with a serious face that they want to have a no-deal Brexit. It doesn't stack up.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.